And I hope you'll forgive me if I start with a short hymn of praise to the Archbishop of Canterbury, because it was actually at his behest that I and others founded the All-Party Group on Inclusive Growth 2 or 3 years ago, which I chair and in which I declare my interest this afternoon. It was His Grace who helped inspire and mobilise the Commission on Economic Justice, and I'd like to congratulate them, Mr Hollowbone, on producing what I think is a seminal report. Tom Kibasi and Michael Jacobs and the entire team of commissioners deserve our gratitude for sharing with us, in detail, a blueprint for reconnecting wealth creation and social justice. This is, of course, ultimately a moral mission. It's ultimately a righteous ambition. And it was actually His Grace who said to us in his first major speech to the All-Party Group, he reminded us that, of course, Jesus was a wealth creator. Jesus worked for his living and created wealth for 90% of his life, the Archbishop reminded us. He, I think, would be unlikely to be much impressed by a country today that is growing both the number of billionaires and the lines at our food banks. For as the Archbishop went on, the foundations of a good economy are given in the nature of human beings: creativity, gratuity, solidarity and subsidiarity. And we, Mr Hollowbone, do not have enough of that today. Branko Milanovic, the New York economist, recently published an extraordinary book in which he set out exactly what has happened to the fruits of growth over the last 30 years. And the extraordinary statistic that he revealed is that an incredible 44% of the absolute gain in total wealth in the last 30 years has gone to the world's richest 5%. Now, what that means for us here in Britain, as Oxfam and others tell us, is that the richest 1% of the UK population now own more than 20 times more wealth than the poorest 20% combined. And on the streets of my constituency, amongst the homeless, amongst the hungry, amongst the young people in despair, amongst disabled people struggling for their social security, I see, feel and share pain. Pain which should not exist in the fifth richest country in the world. But the point of this report is not to kick off a slanging match. The point of this report is actually to kindle a peace match, an adult conversation that might one day grow in strength and foster something akin to the kind of cross-party consensus that we had on economic policy after World War II. And so it is in that spirit that I want to begin my remarks with actually some self-criticism about the past in order to help steer us in the future. We achieved many fine things between 1997 and 2010, but with a lead that was greater than Attlee's, we left a legacy that was considerably less. In power, we failed to tame and reform capitalism and bend it to the people's purposes. And that is what we must seek to do in the future. There was, of course, the tragic scars of error in Iraq, but elsewhere we rolled forward public finance instead of reinvigorating a new public ethos, and our party was too top-down when we should have renewed bottom-up. And that in part explained why we acquiesced in too much financial engineering and not enough real engineering. And so in the face of the China shock, which unfolded after the World Trade Organization was joined by China, and in the face of the doubling of the size of Europe after the Berlin Wall came down, we let too many communities de-industrialise. And yes, we created jobs, but we did not create enough good jobs. So manufacturing powerhouses like Burnley or Barnsley fared very differently to Berlin or Beijing, which took a different way forward. We allowed too much globalisation without compensation. Now, in the spirit of that self-reflection, I hope that ministers will accept that we cannot go on with today's economic muddle when what we need to agree is an economic model that will take us to a different kind of country in which we are better at creating wealth and an awful lot better at sharing wealth. Today, we face a triple curse. We have growth that is too slow. We have rates of growth now which are far slower than the trend rate of growth that was achieved in the new Labour years. We have productivity that is too weak. The rates of productivity growth today are lower than they were at the end of the 1970s, Mr Hollowbone, when we used to call it British disease. And wages, despite today's news, are still much, much too unfair. We still have the largest squeeze on wages since the days of Charles Dickens. And ministers now need to confront what capitalism around us has become. In our workplace, our workers now face a much smaller group of companies, the great technopolies created by the $20 trillion merger wave of the last 20 years, that now power world trade, that now dominate world technology, and use this power of technology and trade, automation and outsourcing to hold down wages. That is why, ultimately, we need a different economic model in this country. Hitherto, we have failed to create what the IPPR calls a new economic constitution, and that is what Britain needs today. Now, the linchpin of this very fine report is what they call a mission-driven industrial strategy. And I know that this is the Minister's first outing. We welcome her to her position. And I suspect that she may well say that Her Majesty's government does indeed have such an industrial plan. But let us be honest with ourselves in this chamber, Mr. Hollowbone. The industrial strategy we have today is nothing compared to the $300 billion Made in China programme. It is nothing compared to Narendra Modi's Make in India campaign. It is nothing compared to Japan's SoftBank $100 billion New Vision Fund. What we need today is an industrial strategy that is financed on a wholly new scale. That means that we should have new fiscal rules to guide our budgeting so that we can drive up public investment in things like infrastructure by an extra £15 billion a year. We need to leverage that with a £200 billion national investment bank with strong regional investment banks on the ground, much like the KfW model that has been such a success in post-war Germany. We need new economic governance systems, like the 4 new economic executives proposed for England, tasked with ending the regional imbalances which have cursed our country for decades. And crucially, we need to leverage this with change to the Bank of England mandate, as I have argued for a number of years now, so that the bank mandate mirrors and seeks not simply price control, but seeks to keep unemployment and underemployment as low as possible. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I think the member for Birmingham and Hodge Hill, and he mentioned earlier on subsidiarity, and he's now mentioned the question of regionalism. And one of the things that struck me in reading this report, the fuller report that he has on his desk there, Scotland has far outperformed all the regions of the United Kingdom except for London and the South East in terms of GVA in the last decade. And of course, Scotland has control over economic development, economic powers. I wonder, would he join me in asking the Minister what assessment her department has made of Wales's potential to increase GVA if Wales had the economic means to do so, as is advocated in this report?
Well, one of the great achievements of our time in office was the devolution that has allowed different economic models to begin to emerge across the United Kingdom. And although there has been growth that has been interesting and impressive in parts of the country, it is nothing compared to what we need for the years ahead. And let's be honest, it is going to be impossible to match what is happening in the East, in Asia, unless we bring behind a strategy the real power of both fiscal policy and banking policy and monetary policy too. Mr. Hollowbone, to rewrite the rules of our labour market, the Commission proposes a real £10.20 minimum wage, set 20% higher for anyone on a 0 hours contract. An important and interesting and innovative idea that I think should command our attention. It proposes New Zealand-style rights of access for trade unions. It proposes crystal clear rights to join a union. And it proposes trials of auto-enrolment in unions for workers in the gig economy. Now, why are these things so important? They're important because of the power that is now exercised by giant firms in our economy. The Economist over the summer reported that the $5 trillion merger wave that has happened in the United Kingdom is, adjusted for scale, 50% greater than we have seen in the United States. That rise in market power, according to, of all people, the IMF, that rise in market power is much more pronounced in the UK than it is elsewhere. They look at markups, price markups, to judge, as a proxy, to judge market power. The markups they found in the United Kingdom are about 60% since 1980. That is way ahead of the average for the advanced economy. We are more dominated than technopolies than many other countries, And the price of that is not paid by shareholders, it's not paid for by chief executives, it is paid for by workers. That is why we need to rewrite the rules of the marketplace to rebalance power in the marketplace. Now, in the boardroom, we should finally privilege those with a genuinely long-term perspective, also known as workers, by putting workers on boards. The IPPR proposes at least 2 on every company board with over more than 250 staff. Why is this important? Because the chief economist of the Bank of England recently reflected that once upon a time, the average shareholding in a British company on the stock exchange was something like 6 years. Now it is only 6 months. Shareholders are no longer the long-term stewards or guardians of a company's interest. Actually, it is workers, and very often suppliers, who have the longer-term interest. We need workers on remuneration committees to stop the ludicrous expansion of chief executive pay. And crucially, we need to change the reform, we need to change Section 172 of the Company Code, which we wrote, in order to ensure that directors have a fiduciary duty to regard the long-term interests of a company and have regard to the welfare of all stakeholders, not simply the stakeholders known as shareholders. In the capital markets, we need new fiduciary duties for asset managers and priority rights for long-term investors, like the rights that are enjoyed by shareholders in France and indeed America and countries like Italy. We need new tests for takeovers, plus crucial reform of competition law to ensure that we introduce a new public interest test to check today's uncontrolled technopolies who are now carving up the digital marketplace. And finally, to ensure that wealth is genuinely shared, we need a new £186 billion Citizens' Wealth Fund proposed to help create the payouts to help our young people in order to help redistribute wealth to our young people who are struggling under the burden of high debt, sky-high student loans, and, of course, the challenge of saving to put down the deposit for a home. To help rebalance the fiscal system, to help make sure there is money available for these things, the IPPR proposes a total overhaul of our tax system with a tax model based on the German-style formula-based calculations of income tax and, crucially, equalisation of income and capital gains tax, much as we had actually when capital gains tax was introduced in the 1960s, and, of course, new wealth taxes. It is extraordinary how I think the stock market is up something like 40% since the financial crash. I think the property market is up by about 25%. The wealth of assets in this country is multiplied exponentially, and yet wealth taxes are still only 5 or 6% of GDP, the level that they have been since the early 1970s. I want to conclude, Mr. Hollowbone, with just a reminder of how much is at stake in this debate. Globally, Oxfam estimate that about half of global wealth is in the hands of the richest few. That means that globally 85 families own as much as the poorest 3 billion of our fellow citizens on this planet. And we can have an argument about how we share the wealth that is on the table today, but surely we can think afresh about the wealth that is to come. If the richest 1% carry on accumulating wealth at the rate that they have enjoyed since the financial crash, they won't own half of world wealth by 2030. They'll own 2/3. 2/3 of global wealth in the hands of the top 1%. It will be impossible for us to restore any meaningful measure of equality this century if we allow that situation to unfold. And of course, what will affect inequality over the years to come is not simply the exponential rise in the wealth and assets of the richest, a rise that we can forecast now up to £217 trillion in the hands of the luckiest few. It's not simply the growth in their wealth that will affect this new outcome. It is what is going to happen to the poorest and the working poorest in our country. And this is where we need to zero in on what is happening in the world of automation, in the world of work. At the World Bank IMF meetings earlier this year, the chief executive of the World Bank was very clear that we know automation is going to hit people in different ways. We know that some people are going to be hit harder than others, and we know that young people are going to be hit hardest of all, and the working class are going to be hit harder still. My research, undertaken together with the House of Commons Library, shows that amongst the poorest 25% of the labour market, so, Mr. Hollowbone, that is someone who is on under £9 an hour. Amongst that group of people, 2.1 million jobs are at risk of automation. 2.1 million. Why? Because automation is going to hit retail, transportation and routine manufacturing, where most of Britain's working class happens to work today. If we lose those jobs, that is a 5 times bigger impact than the shutdown of the coal industry and the steel industry put together. Think about how those communities are still scarred today by those seminal changes during the 1980s. Yet we can see these changes in our economy unfolding ahead. Those workers will be the workers left behind in tomorrow's economy unless we change strategy. So we have to answer a question, Mr. Hollowbone, today, which is, are we prepared to stand by and watch this happen? I say that we cannot and that we will not. We need new ideas, and we need to turn those ideas into action. We have a blueprint for those ideas today, and I would like the Minister to tell us just what she disagrees with in this seminal report. Yeah.